Welcome back to another episode in my everyday cosplay series where I take costume pieces from my favorite movies and shows and turn them into accessories that you can wear all the time. Today, I'm taking inspiration from the most badass woman in Lord of the Rings, Eowyn, of course. I decided to use the bodice of this dress as my inspiration and turn it into a belt. The edge of the bodice has this repeating spiral pattern with leaves on either side. I started drawing up some designs using my drawing program Leonardo and Inkscape to digitize everything. As usual, I went through a number of iterations before settling on the final pattern. You can find my patterns in my Etsy shop in all sizes, so you can make your own. The belt is about 3 inches wide and laces up at the back with elastic, leather, or ribbon. My patterns can be printed on US leather or A4 paper, and just make sure to print at actual size, cut along the dotted lines, and tape it together. I recommend at least 6-ounce veg tan for belts. I'm using an 8-ounce veg tan cowhide here. I have some skill with a blade, so I cut the belt from my hide using a sharp X-Acto knife and a ruler, making sure to use a cutting mat behind to protect my table. I beveled the front and back edges of the belt with a number 2 edge beveler. This just sort of rounds the edges. I actually tooled this belt while camping, which explains the gingham tablecloth. This actually ended up being a really great move because it was so damp and cool that I had so much time for the tooling, which made it so much easier than it normally is. It's so dry in the city where I live. I cased the leather, laid my pattern on top, and transferred the pattern using a pencil. I like to use a pencil because then I can keep track of which lines I've already traced. Then I began my tooling. I used this teardrop stamp to tool the leaves along the edges. Then I used a swivel knife to carve out the vines and the edges of the spirals and the leaves. I'm really trying to train myself out of the bad habit of constantly spinning the leather while I'm doing my cuts. This is a good project to practice that. Then I used this textured bevel stamp to go around the edges of all of the spirals, and I used a smooth bevel stamp to go around the edges of all of the leaves. Then I used this background stamp to add some texture around all of the spirals. I then used my airbrush to apply the dye. I used a couple different colors to create some shading. While it was still damp, I slicked the edges. I left the dye to dry for a few hours and then came back over it with 2 coats of watered down acrylic resin, which is my finish of choice. I slicked the edges again after each coat. I left the finish to dry and then used Fiebing's antique finish paste to highlight the tooling. I rubbed it on, swirling around to make sure it was filling all of the carvings, and then wiped the excess off of the surface using a flattened paper towel. Once that was completely dry, I applied a thin coat of Resin to the entire project with my airbrush to seal it all in. And then I punched holes for the ties, and then I used elastic as I find it's the most comfortable. And now you're ready to slay the Witch King. You can find a playlist with all of my other everyday cosplay projects here, and follow along for more shenanigans.